Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another fun-filled lecture video. Today, what we are going to be talking about is the rest of Unit 2, so this final topic, and it's on environmental consequences of connectivity. So we're looking at, through this unit, the networks of exchange for, 1200 to 1450 in, what I called or have called is the known world. So Afro-Eurasia. All of this will pretty much change once we get into our next unit, but for right now, we're only going to focus on 1200 to 1450. So we are looking at just the environmental effects that these various networks had on Afro-Eurasia. So we're going to look at diseases. So there was continued diffusion of crops and pathogens. So you saw epidemic diseases like the bubonic plague. With the diffusion of crops, you saw bananas, rice, citrus, all sorts of things expand across Afro-Eurasia. So let's talk about these epidemic diseases for a second. So we know that on these trade routes, you not only saw the exchange of goods, but you also saw the exchange of diseases. Because as these areas were opened up, you saw people who were exposed to unfamiliar pathogens. So they didn't have a whole lot of immunity there. Thanks, trade. This same thing happened on a greater scale in the New World when Europe started to explore. The same thing happened. As soon as Asia started opening up into the rest of the world, you started to see this exchange of diseases. Smallpox and measles completely devastated populations in both Rome and in Han China. This is one of the contributing factors to Rome's collapse. It was one of the reasons that's listed out those diseases in the public health crisis because they were not exposed to it prior. So these diseases actually led to an increase in religion. So in Europe, you saw people who were exposed to the plague and, the smallpox and measles. They started leaning on their faith a lot more because specifically in Europe, they didn't have a whole lot of medical advances. So they were relying on their faith to save them. So that's increased the appeal of faith. So they had faith offered both a compassion, both of the, all of the faiths offered compassion in the face of suffering. And it wasn't until in Europe that people started to realize the church and their faith wouldn't alone save them that, the Catholic Church started to kind of lose their influence. So this image is probably one of the most fascinating images to me because this shows you the spread of the bubonic plague. So this is the plague that went through Europe and completely devastated their population. And a lot of times throughout history, we teach that the plague, we call it Justinian's plague, just like we call the Great Influenza of 1918 the Spanish flu. And it was because, this is the first time that anybody had really seen anything like this. So they called it Justinian's plague because that's when people really started to pay attention, especially in the Mediterranean. No, never mind that the bubonic plague didn't hit its height or hit in Constantinople until 1347, whereas in some provinces in Asia, Southeast Asia, and China, you see before 1320 or 1320, 1321, 1323. So we know now that this plague kind of originated in China and Southeast Asia and then made its way into the Middle East and then eventually the rest of the world. We know this because the Mongols helped spread it. We did talk about that one a lot. So this is just looking at the spread of the bubonic plague in Europe in particular. kind of the Asia Minor and into Europe. And we can see that Constantinople, approximately the first breakout was in 1347, and then from there on out, it started to grow. The biggest jump was in 1348 when you really started to see this pop up everywhere. And then it starts to go a little bit more north. Oh, yeah. Now, I am going to reiterate where it says relatively unaffected. That doesn't mean they weren't affected by the bubonic plague. It's just they weren't as affected by it. Historians have, researched this and believe that the reason why it hit so hard in the rest of Europe but left, smaller little pockets relatively unaffected because of the density of population. Typically, the bubonic plague would hit really hard the areas that were much more densely populated because you have people living on top of people and people crammed into small spaces. So it makes sense that a disease would ravage these places, these densely populated areas, more than they would in rural spaces. So, what were the effects of the plague? Well, one of them was you saw the decline in urbanization and trade. So, people were no longer flocking to the cities, and trade slowed. You ultimately had the demise of the Mongol Empire just 100 years after its creation. So, we have talked about the fact that the Mongols, disappeared on paper, but they just kind of assimilated into the societies that they lived in. And it was also because the Mongols were not immune to the plague. They got it as well. Some of the other effects were labor shortages. We know this is specifically in Europe with the feudal system, that it allowed workers who weren't paid before to demand wages and better working conditions. And those who were getting paid could demand higher wages. And this also created way more opportunities for women. So women found their voice and could also earn money. So because of these peasant revolts, it undermined this whole idea of serfdom in the feudalism system in Europe. So you saw the collapse of feudalism and the rise of these absolute monarchs. Wah, wah. Guess what we're talking about next? And it also created a labor shortage, and that may have fostered a greater interest in pushing for these technological advances because they were trying to cut back on paying for higher wages. So this would ultimately lead to the Industrial Revolution, is because they were trying to find a way around paying people more money for a job that could be done, by a machine of some sort. You also saw this disruption of Mongol-based land routes to the east, and you also had a desire to avoid Muslim intermediaries. So as a result, this is what pushed Europe to seek a sea route to trade with India into the spice market. They wanted to still reach the riches of the East into the spice market, but they didn't want to deal with the Mongols, who were terrible. And they also didn't want to deal with Muslims, because you have to remember that the Crusades were all about pushing out the Muslims from the Holy Lands. And that created this huge animosity between Christians and Muslims. So they wanted to avoid Muslims at all cost. Not to mention, we learned that the Reconquista forced people out of their home to reclaim it in the name of a Catholic king. So Europeans essentially became the new Mongols in the Indian Ocean. They were pretty fierce, and it was all in response to finding a better way to trade with the East, and it was by all means necessary. So these are just images of what the bubonic plague, looked like or did. I highly encourage you guys to read these quotes because it is heart heartbreaking, for real, heartbreaking, what the Black Death did to not only those who experienced it, but to also the people who had to, like the people who stayed back and watched, like the people who were left. And there was a lot of survivor guilt going on there. So let's talk about the diffusion of crops. This is where things get really interesting. So you had an introduction of new crops called champa rice to China. So this was a new strain that was from Vietnam, and it was found somewhere in the Song dynasty. And this rice became instrumental because the time it took to grow it was cut in half, which meant that you could get more of it faster. So it changed the game in China. In the Americas, you saw the use of what's called chinampas, and chinampas are floating gardens. What the Aztec did, because their city of Tenochtitlan was built in the middle of a lake, what they did to get arable land to grow food is that they would go to the shallow bed of the lake. They would dig up some of the soil, the silt, the lake bed, and they would mix it with rock and twigs and create this floating mass of land that they would build a garden into. And because they used the rich, the nutrient-rich lake bed, meant that they could grow just about anything. So 2/3 of all the food that they used or consumed in Tenochtitlan actually came from these floating gardens. Argue with me that the Aztec were not the most civilized people in the world at that point in time. Argue. Change my mind. Changed my mind. Change it. Also, in the Americas, you saw the use of what's called waru. And this was a new way of farming that basically left irrigation canals in between rows of crops. Genius. So creating this helped limit erosion, and it also helped create a collection system for rainwater. And it would also allow the rainwater to fall into these little canals in between the rows of crops, and the crops could drink up the water, soak up the water as they needed it. Game changer. And then also in the Philippines and Peru specifically, but anywhere where you had mountainous territory and you needed farmable land, you saw what's called terracing. And so basically, they would create steps into the side of the mountain using stone walls to create arable land so that they could grow and they could farm. In Peru in particular, with the Incan Empire, when they did this, the Andes Mountains can get really cold. So these terraces did twofold. It allowed them to farm on very steep mountainsides, but also the rock would soak up the warmth of the sun during the day so that at night it could release this radiant heat back into the soil, so it kept the plants warm and kept them growing. Genius. Absolute genius. Again, tell me that they are not, colonizers. Anyway, so with the spread of these rice varieties, you started seeing fast ripening, drought resistant rice being grown in China. It also, this practice encouraged terrace farming, as you can see here with the rice. One of these downsides, though, is that the terraced farming altered the environment and the landscape. Because I don't know if you knew this, but this is not natural. They had to cultivate and carve the land to be able to do this. So this map actually shows you how rice spread from China throughout the rest of Asia. And the greener or the more blue it is, that means that it hasn't been there for that long. right? Pretty stinking incredible. Next up, you have bananas. So Indonesian sailors traveled the Indian Ocean um, basin and actually introduced bananas to sub-Saharan Africa. This allowed Bantu speakers to migrate to areas where yams, their traditional crop, sweet potatoes, wouldn't grow. And this gave them more freedom. And then Indonesians actually settled in Madagascar and permanently changed the cultural and racial makeup of the island. Incredible. You also see cotton being used more and more. So there are two strains of cotton, one originating in India in Central Asia, and then one in like Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula. And both of these types of cotton would spread rapidly. So you had it spread one strain all over Asia and one strain all over the Middle East and into Africa. Again, changing the landscape. Now, the issue ultimately became um, with terrace farming and more food equals more population and more population equals more demand for food. So because of that, you see deforestation start to happen at rapid speed. And we all know the consequences of deforestation. You have climate change becoming a factor. You no longer have plants that can, filter the air. And then you also have, with all of the vegetation, you have also a growth in need for meat. And because of that, you have the issue of what's called overgrazing. That means leaving your animals in one place for too long basically means they kill and eat all of the vegetation, leaving nothing but like a desert behind. And then one of the biggest problems that we still have to this day is soil erosion. Because you are altering the landscape, it opens it up to easily erode and disappear. And these are things that we have to be careful with. And these are also factors that we still deal with to this day in the year 2020. Right? I will see you guys later. Bye.